Hello, my name is Eric Siegel, and I am one of the pastors at the Village Church. The following podcast is a ministry of the Village Church. We hope that it inspires you, that it draws you closer to Jesus, and it opens your eyes to the possibilities of living in the kingdom. Enjoy, and God bless. Got out. There's canceled. Okay. All right. So, David Sommitz is preaching. David's not up here a lot, so give the man a hand. And every time he turns to you, just smile and give him a thumbs up so he's feeling good as he's up here. All right, man.
All right. Let me pray. Am I on? I'm on. Jesus, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be redeemed by your blood. Amen. So, we've made it to the action in John. So we're, for like maybe the last 6 or so weeks, we suddenly went into slow motion and a lot happened in the chapters, but it was just over a span of a few days. And now we're coming to the action. We just had the fourth quarter speech from Jesus, prepping his disciples for the coming of the advocate. And then Jesus prayed for his disciples, and he prayed for us, for those who have yet to believe. And then we come to John 18, and there's a lot happening in John 18. So first, Jesus goes into the garden with his disciples, into Gethsemane. And Judas comes with a band of ruffians, and they confront and arrest him. And Peter thinks it's a good idea to fight out, and he cuts off a guy's ear. Jesus talks him down from that and surrenders himself willingly. Then he goes and he gets taken before the Sanhedrin, the Jewish priests, and they question him, and they put on a farce of a trial. And it's very clear that he is innocent of the charges that they're bringing against him, but they still move him forward, and they bring him to Pilate because they don't have the authority to execute him, to kill him, and they want him dead. So they bring him to Pilate, and Pilate has his first series of interactions with him, and Pilate makes the same conclusion that's obvious from his initial questioning, which is, this guy is innocent. And then he brings them back to the Jews, and they say, no, we want this guy crucified. In fact, yeah, give us the criminal Barabbas and whatever. We just want this guy dead. So things kind of have gone from bad to worse. And my tendency is to read this chapter and think, okay, here's the bad stuff before we get to the good stuff. And that is true in a sense, because Pastor Eric preached on Resurrection Sunday, on Easter Sunday. He talked about how the resurrection is the linchpin. It is crucial to all of our faith. So if Jesus did not resurrect from the dead, we're all wasting our time here. This is a farce, and we're to be pitied above all. But he did rise from the dead. And because of that, we can view John chapter 18 through the lens of the gospel. And our working definition of the gospel is the good news and the victories of Jesus Christ. So I want to look through this lens, and this is kind of an act of repentance for me, because it is hard for me to grasp the greatness of Jesus Christ. So I want to use metaphor as we go through this chapter. When my kids ask me about a skyscraper, something that is beyond their imagination, Luke, my 2-year-old, he reaches his hands as high as he can, and he says, I think it's this big. And then Lucy can come in, and she's my 3-year-old, and she says, oh, no, it's this big. And then I, as the daddy, get to say, no, guys, it's this big. And they say, whoa. I have not conveyed a fraction of the reality of the height of a skyscraper, right? I haven't even put my hand through the ceiling. But in their limited capacity of understanding, it is a helpful metaphor to point them to the reality of a skyscraper. So, I want to talk about action heroes and superheroes today. They should point us towards Jesus. When we think of Superman, that should point us towards the greater Superman, which is Jesus. So, as we talk through this, I think a helpful guideline is to go to Ephesians, where Paul talks about the armor of God. So the first thing about that, it indicates that this is an appropriate thing to use physical metaphor to talk about a spiritual truth. So when we talk about the shield of faith, we are not generally talking about a physical shield, right? But it helps us to better understand what faith is doing in the spiritual world. So then the next part to hold on to that I want us to keep in mind is the very next sentence that Paul says in Ephesians is, "For our struggle is not against flesh and blood." It's against the spiritual darkness. So, if we think about superheroes and we recognize that they point us to Jesus, if we take that and say, well, to be more like Jesus, I'm going to go beat people up and get really strong, we've missed the metaphor, right? We've missed the truth. So with that, let's go into talking about superheroes. So I kind of got into the superhero mythology around like 10 or 11 years old. And one of my favorite things to do was go onto Wikipedia and look up the statistics of the superheroes. These made-up people in Wikipedia could tell me what their actual superpowers were. And so I would go and I would read about the Incredible Hulk and how when he got angry, he would get big and green. But then when he was even more angry, he could get a little bit bigger and he could now lift a ton. But then when he was extremely angry, he could lift 5 tons and he was like 5 feet taller than he was before. And I loved getting into that. We have 66 books that are the stats of the superpowers of Jesus. And Colleen read for us one part of the stats of Jesus. So I want to meditate on Psalm 1 for a bit. So some translations help us to understand when it says blessed is the man, they say blessed is the one, which is an appropriate way to look at this because this is going to list off ways that we can act righteously and follow Jesus, and that is not exclusively a man thing, right? Women also can emulate these characteristics, but I want us to look at it a little differently today. There is one man ever who perfectly satisfies all of these superpowers that Psalm 1 talks about. So when we read Psalm 1, let's read it as though it is saying, "Blessed is Jesus, magnified is Jesus, who walks not in the counsel of the wicked." So the first thing with the wicked, if you're anything like me, when I think of the word wicked, I picture someone who's like real disfigured and has a scary voice and a bunch of hair on their face and stuff. And I picture this really weird caricature and I think, oh yeah, there's those wicked people who, and I'm not like the wicked, right? But wicked actually just means guilty. So it's just the people who have fallen short. So Jesus does not walk in the counsel of those other than the counsel of God, nor stands in the way of sinners. Jesus does not go and stand in the path of sinners. Sometimes we'll do that. I'll do that. I'll say, well, you know what? I see that path and I know it's bad, but it wouldn't be that big of a deal if I just stood in the path for a little bit, right? Jesus doesn't even stand in the path. And finally, he does not sit in the seat of scoffers. So when we were growing up, my brothers and I practiced a liturgy of scoffing and mocking. And I was thinking about, well, what's the difference between scoffing and mocking and teasing and like a friendly teasing? So I think the difference is this is talking about scorn. And when you scorn someone, you are intentionally making jokes that diminish that person's value. Jesus does the opposite. He uplifts and upholds and highlights our value. And then next, his delight is in the law of the Lord. Or in other words, Jesus delights in the instruction of the Father. Pastor Mark talked about how there's not a whole lot of elements to Jesus' ministry when we look at it. He's doing a lot of healing, he's doing preaching, and then he's going and spending time with the Father. Jesus is like a tree planted by streams of water that yields its fruit in its season, and its leaf does not wither. So Jesus is a stable, strong source of life, and it's Jesus, everything that he does prospers. So we're going to see that as we go through John chapter 18. All the things that he does, even in this dark hour, he is prospering. He is doing what he sets out to accomplish. And we're going to see that the wicked, in contrast, are not so. They're like chaff that the wind drives away. Peter's going to get blown by the wind and behave just depending on what people are saying or what's going on in the moment. Meanwhile, Jesus is standing as a strong, firm tree of righteousness. And then, this is another, I think, important part to set aside the misconceptions we have about the wicked. So we're not talking about, the others. This is talking about the guilty. The sinners are not going to stand in the judgment. And again, Pastor Mark talked about how when we're talking about judgment, we're talking about victory. So the sinners, the others, are not going to be victorious. Jesus is and will be victorious. And then sinners in the congregation of the righteous. So we are in the congregation of the righteous because Jesus has made us righteous. And Jesus knows the way of the righteous, and the way of the wicked will perish. So we'll get into that in a little bit. So to go through this, I want to go through this chapter. I want to do what Pastor Eric invited us to do with the whole book, which is to work our way backwards. So we're going to start at the last part, and then we're going to work our way backwards. So we're going to start with Pilate's interaction with Jesus, starting at verse 33. Pilate then went back inside the palace, summoned Jesus, and asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" "Is that your own idea?" Jesus asked. "Or did others talk to you about me?" "Am I a Jew?" Pilate replied. "Your own people and chief priests handed you over to me. What is it that you have done?" Jesus said, "My kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my servants would fight to prevent my arrest by the Jewish leaders. But now my kingdom is from another place." "You are a king then," said Pilate. Jesus answered, "You say that I am a king. In fact, the reason I was born and came into the world is to testify to the truth. Everyone on the side of truth listens to me." "What is truth?" retorted Pilate. So what we see here is the classic mismatch that happens in superhero movies, where the superhero is about to go and take on the big, bad arch villain. So in our case, Jesus is about to go and conquer death. And on the way, he encounters a man with a gun who's used to having his way and controlling his environment. But that man with the gun suddenly comes across someone who's bulletproof. Pilate is a governor. He has authority. And especially in the presence of a prisoner, he's expecting to kind of get his way. But Jesus does something interesting here. He could have chosen to be silent. Instead, he engages with Pilate. And I think what he's doing here is he's highlighting Pilate's value, and he's confronting him with the truth that Pilate needs to hear. So, Pilate is asking him, well, are you a king, or what have you done? Ultimately, Jesus says, he presents him with his righteousness and his truth and his authority. And here, Pilate could have done a couple of different things. One, he could have knelt before Jesus, before God, and said, wow, you're the Lord. Or he could have said, no, I reject you completely, and I'm not going to have anything to do with your authority. Instead, he took the third way, which is same way that we often take. He retorts with a question, saying, what is truth? He's not sincerely asking this question, right? He is hiding behind a cloud of confusion, which protects him from the authority of Jesus. So Jim Roth gave us a sermon a few months ago now, where he talked about he was in this situation where he was trying to understand the right and wrong of a situation. And it wasn't until someone responded and said, do you want to submit yourself to Jesus' authority no matter what? As soon as he made the decision, yes, I do want to submit myself to Jesus' authority, the cloud of confusion just vanished. It went away. So that's what Pilate's doing here. Even though his question is not sincere, it is a question worth asking. So what is truth? So, in my mind, basketball players are kind of superheroes, so it fits in with my theme. Most of you may recognize the guy in white. His name is LeBron James, arguably one of the greatest players ever. The guy in the green, however, I don't know him as well. I didn't get to see him play most of his career. His name is Paul Pierce, and you might have guessed what his nickname is that was given by Shaquille O'Neal. He said, "This man is the truth." And I love this because Paul Pierce was a good basketball player, but what he was best at was scoring and being effective in that fourth quarter moment when it mattered most. This is the guy that you wanted to hold the ball. Not LeBron, actually, right? Which is a whole other rabbit trail. But so I don't think Shaq understood what he was doing when he gave Paul Pierce this nickname, but I think it gives us something helpful to meditate on, because the truth is not a set of equations and rules that if we can just wrap our minds around that, then we can understand everything and bend reality to our will. The truth is a person that we have to wrestle with and reckon with. So when Jesus says, "I am the truth and the way and the life," we have to reckon with the person of God when we are considering what the truth is. Okay, so now we're going to move backwards and read about Jesus being before the Sanhedrin. So this is his trial. Meanwhile, the high priest questioned Jesus about his disciples and his teaching. "I have spoken openly to the world," Jesus replied. "I always taught in synagogues or at the temple where all the Jews come together. I said nothing in secret. Why question me? Ask those who heard me. Surely they know what I said." When Jesus said this, one of the officials nearby slapped him in the face. "Is this the way you answer the high priest?" he demanded. "If I said something wrong," Jesus replied, "testify as to what is wrong. But if I spoke the truth, why did you strike me?" So, as I was trying to come up with more, what are the superhero connections to this, I was asking myself, what is one of the coolest possible things you can witness in a superhero movie? And what I came up with was walking away from explosions in slow motion. So you see this played over and over again to the point that actually now it's kind of become a comedic effect. But I think it at least started out as a really legitimately cool thing. So I want to talk about what is it that makes walking away from explosions in slow motion cool. First thing, this person is in control. This person knows the score, and their actions speak for themselves. So, to the first point, we've been talking for the last few weeks about how we need to be giving up control. And that's true. So I want to talk about the distinction here. Jesus is in control, and there is a way we are invited to be in control, because control is a fruit of the Spirit. Control of what? Self. So God gives us a realm of control over things that we are supposed to be in control of. And when we work outside of that is when we start to go wrong. But Jesus shows us in this whole passage that he is in control. So there's an explosion going on. There's chaos in the background, and it seems really dangerous. And all this time, Jesus is in control, and he knows the score. So it seems like this is a really dire moment, right? I mean, the Jewish priests have the upper hand, and Jesus is getting misunderstood, and there's accusations thrown up against him. And Peter especially, he thinks that, wow, we're really in trouble. And so when someone comes along and questions, hey, do you know this guy? You're part of following Jesus, right? He's like the chaff talked about in Psalms. He immediately is like, well, no. I don't know that guy. I don't have anything to do with him. Meanwhile, Jesus is still walking forward in slow motion while all the explosions are going on. And he's able to let his actions speak for himself. So when he says, why question me? Ask those who heard me. The reason he's able to do that is because he has complete integrity. He is consistent, and so he doesn't have to say anything new here. And when they are confronted with the righteousness, with the integrity of Jesus, the response is to lash out in violence. And I think this is one of the other places where we need to relate with this. How are we striking out in violence when we're confronted with Jesus' righteousness? So this guy, he's also sitting in the seat of mockers, I think, here. He's saying, is that the way you answer the high priest? He's making light of the situation. And in this moment, I thank God that life is not fair. Because what would have been fair is for Jesus to turn back to the guy, snap his fingers, and he blows up into a million pieces and is never seen again. Instead, Jesus asks a piercing question because he values this person. He says, if I spoke the truth, why did you strike me? And I think that's a question that person, I hope at least, that they went and wrestled with. But I want us to use our imaginations and think about what are the ways that we strike out. And Jesus is asking us, if I've spoken the truth, why are you striking out in violence? So lastly, we come to the garden. Starting in verse 3. So Judas came to the garden, guiding a detachment of soldiers and some officials from the chief priests and the Pharisees. They were carrying torches, lanterns, and weapons. Jesus, knowing all that was going to happen to him, went out and asked them, "Who is it you want?" "Jesus of Nazareth," they replied. "I am he," Jesus said. and Judas the traitor was standing there with them. When Jesus said, "I am he," they drew back and fell to the ground. Again he asked them, "Who is it you want?" "Jesus of Nazareth," they said. Jesus answered, "I told you that I am he. If you are looking for me, then let these men go." This happened so that the words he had spoken would be fulfilled. "I have not lost one of those you gave me." So this is a scene. Anyone know the movie? Superman 2, in which Clark Kent, aka Superman, loses his powers. And throughout the middle part of the movie, he is suddenly without all of his super strength and speed and his bulletproof nature. And the low point in the movie, in my opinion, is where he goes into this diner and the guy in plaid is being rude and mean to everyone, and he's just basically darkness. And Clark, still being the same person, says, "I'm not going to stand for this." And he tries to stand up to the guy. And the guy, even though he's a little bit shorter than him, he beats him up. He cleans his clock. And then Clark's on the ground. Lois is comforting him, and his nose is bleeding. And it's just this terrible picture of the humanity and the vulnerability of Superman. So to go to this part of the story, we have to go back to almost the very beginning in Genesis, where a different sinless man is in a different garden and he's confronted by darkness. So Adam is in Eden, and the serpent comes and he deceives Adam and Eve, and they eat of the fruit, and hence the fall of man, because they did not trust in the word of the Father. And then Jesus comes in Gethsemane, and he sets things right. So at the end of Superman 2, after he's regained his powers, after he's defeated the arch-villain, he comes back into this same diner, and of course things go differently this time, right? The bully tries to punch him in the stomach, and this time he hits steel. And it's this satisfying rhyme at the end of the movie where we see how things have been set right. So let's talk about the ways that Jesus has set things right in the garden as the new Adam. Adam chose silence. So as the serpent is there twisting the words of God, speaking things that I think Adam probably knows aren't quite true, he chooses silence. Jesus instead steps forward. He's the first to talk. He knows what's going to go on, and he meets it head on. I think this is the most important part. They're both afraid. So Adam is afraid, and he admits to God afterwards that I was afraid, so I hid. Jesus is also afraid, right? It's not discussed in the Gospel of John, but just before this, he has been sweating blood, pleading with the Father, if there's any other way for me to set this right, for us to set this right, let me get out of this. He is not looking forward to what's going on, what's going to happen. But it says, Jesus, knowing all that was going to happen to him, went out. He stepped forward. Adam, when asked about what happened, he blames Eve. He says, well, the woman you gave me, she did this. Jesus, as soon as he's identified himself, the first thing he says is, if you are looking for me, then let these men go. His priority is to protect and uphold the value of others. And Adam, of course, ultimately chooses to trust the enemy's word. Jesus, in his superpower, he continues to trust in the goodness of the Father, and he trusts in the words of the Father, and he says, After Peter strikes out with a sword, he says, "Put your sword away. Shall I not drink the cup the Father has given me?" And I think that highlights the importance of delighting in the instruction of the Father. Jesus isn't just, okay, now I got to remember to trust God. He is pouring himself into and dedicating his heart towards the Father. So he's setting forth that example. So things have been set right in the garden. But I kind of jumped past one little part of this. So we have to talk about every superhero has a name, but a name by itself is just a combination of syllables and phonemes that are just, the vibrations in our vocal cords coming out of our lips, right? It doesn't mean anything until it's tied and attached to an identity. So here's some examples. Mufasa is the good lion king of the Pride Lands, and the hyenas recognize the power of Mufasa, and when his name is spoken, they shudder. And Scar recognizes, hey, I see the power of Mufasa's name, and I'm not even going to allow it to be spoken. In the Harry Potter series, Lord Voldemort is so powerful that people aren't willing to speak his name. They just say, you know who, because they don't want to bring forth what his name brings forth. And we have to talk about Anthony Edwards here because he's had a fantastic season. He's this rising superstar. But whenever he's discussed, another name gets brought up. Someone says, that guy kind of reminds me of Michael Jordan. As soon as that name is spoken, then the next response is blasphemy, which is reasonable for other reasons that we can get into. But the name of Michael Jordan is revered, and you can't just throw that name around without consequences. Lastly, in the bottom right is the bat signal. So Batman is a different kind of superhero because he doesn't really have any physical superpowers. His superpower is that he's rich and he's got a lot of gadgets. But the thing that he uses to his advantage is his identity. Because when the bat signal shines in the sky, it is calling Batman towards where he needs to go fight evil. But it is also a warding effect against evil because they also see that, and the signal calls forth the identity of Batman. So I wrote an H on my hand because I wanted to remember this word that we talk about every third week with the kids, which is hallowed. And I think we need to wrestle with the idea that God's name is hallowed. And so in this passage, we get to see one of the ways that this takes effect. I don't really love this translation because when they call out and they say, we want Jesus of Nazareth, it says he responds by saying, I am he. His actual response here, he says, I am. And as soon as he says that, he is identifying himself with the voice in the burning bush that is speaking to Moses about how he is going to free his people from Egypt. Suddenly, we're not messing with a human in the garden. We suddenly see, this is God, and he's proclaiming himself. And what happens? They drew back and fell to the ground. There's different types of interpretations here, but I think when he spoke his name, it created a shockwave that blew everyone back because that is what the name of God is capable of doing. And a side note, I really had a hard time finding a good picture of a shockwave, so this is the best I could do. But I love this moment because whatever happened here, the identity of God is called out and it's made clear if you're paying attention. But Judas and Peter miss it. So after this, we're going to sing a song and wrestle with and engage with the failings of these men in this story. But I intentionally didn't want to talk too much on them because my tendency when I read this story is also to just conclude, man, look at how Peter denied, I'm like Peter and we're just terrible and I'll try to be less terrible next time. I want us to really meditate and focus on the goodness and the superpower of Jesus. But let's talk a little bit about what happened here. I think that Peter failed to use his shield of faith in both of these circumstances. So one of the ways we talk about faith is allegiance. So faithfulness. Peter forsakes his allegiance to Jesus in this moment when he's asked 3 different times. And then he also neglects to trust or to put his trust in the power of God. And I think that's one of the things that we can take away from this is if we're not really paying attention and looking for the ways that Jesus is powerful in our lives, we're going to miss it. And we're going to make the wrong decision if we're not looking for Jesus' greatness. Because I think Peter probably felt righteous when he struck out with a sword, right? I don't think he was thinking, well, I'm going to make the wrong choice here because I just don't feel good. I mean, maybe he did. But I think the real mistake he made is to lose sight of who was there, who was in control. He lost sight of the tree of righteousness that Jesus is. But the good news is that Jesus is enough, even though we are not. And I think it's profound that Jesus informs Peter ahead of time of that he's going to fail in this way. I don't think it's so that he can rub it in and say, hey, remember how bad you are, Peter. I think he's saying, you're going to mess up, and you're not enough, and that's okay, because I am. So I don't know if I have time for questions. We have time for, all right. So what is the Spirit laid on your heart?
It is now. It's on. So I really like this superhero metaphor. I've not been very into superhero movies, but I like how you've tied it to Jesus and those characteristics that we want to follow. And I think that's what makes a good superhero. And so I can't help but think of the book of Eli and his superpowers coming from the word of God that he meditated on day and night. And so, yeah.
Nice.
I was following along with painting all that fire, and I put a friend in front of it who's going through trials and a shield in her hand. And we talked in Kid Matins about how the joy of the Lord is our strength. The opposite of joy maybe our doubt and our fear. We were all on the ground and saying different things we believed about God and getting a little higher up and a little higher up and a little higher up. It just made me think of that. I appreciate what you did today. Maybe we're all walking through the flames unafraid because of who he is.
Mm-hmm. Anna.
I was picturing myself with the crowd that was there with Jesus, and
Yeah.
I was part of that. And how many times I still go back to that moment and be part of them as the disciples and the soldiers. But then I went back, and I thank you that you cross-reference with Ephesians. And there's a part over there when, I think it's just before he start explaining the different soldiers' parts, it says, but we stand, just stand firm. It doesn't call us to fight, and because Jesus already did for us, and he's doing it for us.
Yeah.
So thank you for doing that cross-reference.
Thanks, Son.
Me and my dad was superheroes, and I was born in August 14. I love superheroes. I love it. This.
Thanks, Bentley.
So I don't know if I'd ever thought about the guy that slapped Jesus when he answered the high priest. You give me pause there. Hopefully he did go home and consider, because I think we all slap Jesus when we think we know what we're doing.
Yeah.
And I thank you for that, David. I'd never thought about that guy before.
Thanks.
I may have missed this because I had to step out for the joys of the restroom, but I hesitant to figure out how to say, like, Jesus is truly man, right? So he is tempted. He's not. So in some ways, he's the opposite of super. Like, he's completely vulnerable, completely. And I think that's an important thing to remember, because I often picture Jesus as this Superman character. Well, of course, he wasn't really tempted. No, he was tempted in every way like I am. And that's hugely important to my faith, because then I identify with him.
Yeah. Yeah, I really easily lose sight of that as well.
Thank you for drawing out this moment of Jesus saying, like, I am, and the people falling back. Because I think in John, what I've enjoyed so far is we've seen these moments of, like, they come to grab him, but they could not, because his hour had not yet come, so he, like, sneaks away. And in this moment, they come to grab him, and he stands there, and they fall back. Even though they fall back, he stays. And then he says again, hey, what are you here for? I love that.
Yeah.
The picture you painted with fear, both Adam and Jesus experiencing fear, and the only difference, they had the same experience of their emotion was the same, and their actions were completely different, kind of pointing to what Rod was just saying of he was human, he experienced the fear, he was terrified, and his actions were superhuman in what he was able to accomplish, and that he inhabits us and allows us to perform those same superhuman actions.
Yeah, I had a hard time drawing that out, because the struggle that I still have is I either think of Jesus as, like, the bulletproof superhero, and then it's boring because I'm like, yeah, of course, like, he's all powerful, he's all knowing, and okay, let's just get on to something different. Or I think of him just as the man, and it's hard for me to hold that duality. And I wonder if that's part of just, the limited capacity of my imagination.
Also, when we get afraid, we either want to fight or fly or fawn, like try to appease the situation. Jesus does none of those, like, completely counter to human instincts. He just stands, which is not on that list of things we do when we're afraid. I mean, I guess freeze, but he's not frozen. He's not frozen. He's
Right.
deliberately standing. So.
All right.